Okay, so after Eduardo's illuminating speech, we will carry on with Thomas Honegger. Thomas is a person that I've known for more than 10 years now, I think, since we met here in Spain, actually, I think in 2004 in Zaragoza. Yeah, and we have been in touch ever since, actually. We have been publishing things together. He is running a publishing house in Switzerland devoted entirely to the work of Tolkien, to studies on Tolkien. And it's, well, by far, I'd say, the most serious series of books being published on Tolkien's work here in Europe, and most sustained. They have published over 30 titles by now. And Thomas is Swiss of origins, but he is currently working in Germany at the University of Friedrich Schiller in Jena, in Thuringia. He received his PhD from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, where he also taught Old and Middle English. So he is the author of From Phoenix to Chanticleer, Medieval English Animal Poetry, that he published in 1996. And he has edited, obviously now, several books with essays on Old and Middle English language and literature. And of course, and the reason why he's here today is that he has published extensively on the work of Tolkien as well. He has also written about Chaucer, about Shakespeare, medieval romance, and he is professor for English medieval studies at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena currently. Thomas, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and you will be discussing Tolkien's approach to the matter of England today, discussing the kind of mythology that he created in order to emphasize certain aspects of English identity, Englishness, and so on and so forth. Feel free whenever you're ready.
Thank you. She's actually kind of building up a little bit. And don't worry, the title here, I took it down in French because it is a quote, so the rest will be in English. So it's about Tolkien and the matter of England. The matter of England. England has not really a kind of a native English mythology, and Tolkien was not the first one to lament this. We already have Edward M. Foster in Howard's End. One of the protagonists thinks about that and asks herself, why has not England a great mythology? Our folklore, so we have folklore but not mythology, has never advanced beyond daintiness, and the greater melodies about our countryside have all issued through the pipes of Greece. So if you want about kind of mythological text, then you use kind of the Greek mythology as a framework. Deep and true as the native imagination can be, it seems to have failed here. It has stopped with the witches and the fairies. And indeed, witches and fairies. Tolkien himself cannot be absolved from daintiness in matters of fairies. So he started out actually writing poems where you have these dainty fairies, and only later on he developed the elves as we know them today. This is an early poem called Goblin Feet, and there, just read out the first few lines. I'm off down the road where the fairy lanterns glowed, and where the little pretty flittermice are flying. Flittermice actually are bats. It's a Germanic word, Fledermaus. So where the flittermice are flying, a slender band of grey runs creepily away, and the hedges and the grasses are a-sighing. The air is full of wings and the blundering beetle things that warn you with their whirring and their humming. Oh, I hear the tiny horns of enchanted leprechauns and the padding feet of many gnomes a-coming. So we're still in the world of, you know, the little fairies with wings, not much kind of bigger than flowers. It's those fairies and the imagination of this kind of fairies that Tolkien later on was writing against, but he started there. Now, how did the English kind of lose their mythology? It is very likely that the English, being the Germanic tribes of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, and some Frisians, coming from what today is northern Germany, Frisia and southern Denmark, when they came over to England, or well, Britain, as it was called in the 5th century. When they came over to Britain in the 5th century, they probably brought along a mythology with them, some tales, some legends. By the way, have you ever come across something called the National Epic of England? A poem or a book or so. You probably know what I'm talking about. A Beowulf. You're familiar with Beowulf? Yeah. Oh yes. What? Well, what is the problem? Okay, Beowulf is written in Old English. Fine. It was written in England by an Anglo-Saxon scribe. Where do the problems begin? There is not one Englishman in there. It's Geats, southern Swedish. Frisians, Franks are mentioned, Danes, but no Englishmen. It takes place in southern Sweden and Denmark. And yeah, there you see already a problem. If a nation has to kind of take recurrence to Beowulf, then you see there is actually a lack of probably native material. And Tolkien and other scholars blame this event for the loss. This is the biotapestry depicting the Norman conquest 1066, when the Norman invasion took place under William the Conqueror. From then onwards, we have about 200 years of French as the language of administration and court. And it is during that time that in other European countries, some of the legends and myths were written down. And so nobody kind of bothered to write down in England those legends and myths of the Anglo-Saxons, who were the, well, the subjugated class, so to speak. The language of the elite was French, and they didn't bother about collecting the legends and myths of the Anglo-Saxons. In the 12th century, we have a kind of a contemporary witness who says the following about the matters, meaning the topics that are worth writing about. It's Jean Bodel, a French writer, in his Roman de Cesne, in the Romance of the Saxons. He says there are 3 topics you can write about: the matter of Rome, the matter of Britain, the matter of France, and of course, no matter of England is mentioned. That's why I put an asterisk. So it's missing here. Just briefly, to give you an idea what these matters are. The matter of Rome. This gentleman here carrying his aged father is Aeneas fleeing from Troy. So the matter of Rome is basically the legends of Troy. Now, what does Troy have to do with Rome? Why isn't it called the matter of Rome? Aeneas, where did he end up? He had a stopover with Dido in northern Africa, but in the end, he's the founding father of Rome. And so the matter of Rome, you can say, is actually the matter of Troy. So the Romans, they derive their legitimation for the empire from the Trojans. So the medieval view of Troy was a bit different than our view. We look at it from the Greek point of view, Homer and so on, and in medieval times we had different sources. So the matter of Rome is basically the foundation of the Roman Empire by the refugees from Troy. The matter of Britain, you're all familiar with that. King Arthur, the sword in the stone, the round table. So that's the matter of Britain. It's a Celtic matter. It's not a Germanic Anglo-Saxon matter topic. And the matter of France, it's about Charlemagne and his knights, the Douzeperes, like Roland and others. Now, once kind of a mythology is lost, how can you recover, or can you recover it? In the 19th century, we have several instances of people trying to recover their lost mythologies, sometimes actually kind of making up a bit of missing mythology. And one kind of prime example is the Kalevala, which was compiled by the Finnish doctor Elias Lönnrot. Lönnrot, he was a medical doctor, and as that he worked also in the rather kind of remote parts of Finland, and he had a keen interest in the oral tradition and the oral songs of those people, and he collected them when he was visiting the far out villages. He transcribed the ballads and put them into an order and presented them as a kind of national epic. And even nowadays, the Finns, their national holiday is the day when the Kalevala was published. So it was so important for them, this book, it established their national identity. To some extent, I think Tolkien would have loved to have something like that for England. He also took over several topics and motives from the Kalevala. For example, the Sampo, which is a kind of a gadget, which is produced by the smith Ilmarinen. It has some kind of similarities to the Silmarils. Or, for example, Kullervo, this tragic hero, is the inspiration for Turin Turambar, which you also mentioned. So Tolkien had this in front of his mind, and he later on in a letter he talked about it. This is a famous excerpt, you may have come across it. He reflects on what he was doing when he started writing the Lost Tales, and then what later on would become the Legendarium, the Silmarillion, and then actually the Lord of the Rings, or the Lord of the Rings would be part of that. He says in this letter to Milton Waldman, "I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country." He never uses actually the phrase mythology of England. He simply says, I want something that I could dedicate to England. Important also, he characterizes this kind of collection of legends and myths. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East. Like Gandalf, I don't go to the East. So if we look at the map of Middle-earth, what does it mean? The Northwest. The Northwest would be Eriador up here with the Shire and parts of the North. This has, to some extent, an effect on the racial geography of Middle-earth. We mentioned it yesterday that Tolkien is sometimes accused of being kind of, fascist in his view, that he presents always these kind of tall, blonde, blue-eyed heroes. This is people who have not read Tolkien, because his heroes, like Aragorn, they are dark-haired, white-skinned, and grey-eyed. So it's not a typical Germanic hero. And that's why I think Viggo Mortensen is actually a good choice for Aragorn. That's Anke Eismann's illustration of Aragorn. Now, who's that guy? Anke Eismann depicts this protagonist as he is described in The Lord of the Rings. If you've just seen the movie, you would never guess. It's kind of a Robin Hood outfit. The first time we encounter him, actually, he's around with his archers. Yeah. It's Faramir. Here, Peter Jackson opted for the blonde, for whatever reason. But the men of Gondor usually are Numenorians, which means they are also dark-haired, usually. If we are looking for Germanic kind of types, we find them with the Rohirrim. The Rohirrim are basically Anglo-Saxons put on horseback instead of getting into the ships. You know, you remember from northern Germany, getting into the ship westward, you end up in England. And Tom Shippey said, you know, Tolkien maybe made this thought experiment. You put them on horseback and send them to the east. Then you get the Rohirrim. And that's basically what they are. They are kind of Germanic people on horseback. Peter Jackson, of course, sometimes come back to his movies. He uses a different kind of aesthetics and a different typology. When someone is bad, you really see his badness. And so if you have a Rohirrim who has turned bad, he is no longer kind of the tall, blonde, blue-eyed, but he has definitely become type, the dark features. He has become Gothicized, so to speak. And I don't have to talk about the orcs. Well, maybe I should, because when we have a northwestern point of view, also from Europe, think about, Britain. There is nothing coming from the west in the Middle Ages. It's the vast ocean. Well, later on some Vikings via Ireland, but basically it's the vast ocean. Nothing is coming from there. If there is a danger, it's coming from the east. And the one kind of big danger that came twice in the Middle Ages were nomadic people from the steppes in the east, the Huns. And the Huns in medieval sources are described a bit like the orcs. Short, strong, broad-shouldered, bow-legged, a bit like apes, and they talk a language you couldn't really kind of call a language. And so, yes, from a modern point of view, the orcs are not very politically correct, but from a medieval point of view, and Tolkien was a medievalist, you got a very nice kind of depiction of the orcs. Now, Tolkien was studying philology. Eduardo talked about words and their meaning, and one of his teachers in Oxford was Joseph Wright. And what you would learn with Wright was how to unlock the memory of past times that is kind of stored in words, in language, so that the languages and the words become windows into the past. I'm not quite sure, are some of you familiar with Grimm's Law? The first consonant shift, yes, yeah, good. Now, then it makes sense what I'm going to tell you. There is a sentence in an Old Norse saga, in Hervara saga. Heifrekker var vegin under Harfada fjöllum. There, King Heidrek was slain under Harvat fells. Now, scholars were wondering, where are these Harvat fells? Now, if you take Grimm's Law, and if you work it backwards, Harvat becomes Carpat. Carpat are the Carpathians. So, obviously, King Heidrek made it into what today is in Romania, and there found his end. So suddenly, by means of philology, you have to know Grimm's Law. You suddenly get a window into the past, you find out where did this actually happen. And this kind of titillated Tolkien to no end. He was very much thrilled by that. He was also thrilled by some of the mysteries and some of the riddles that language posed, which couldn't be solved by means of Grimm's Law. And one of those mysteries is a line in an Old English poem called Christ. Eala Earendel engla beorchtast, over midanjard monnum sendet. Which means basically, lo, Earendel, the brightest of the angels, is sent as a sign to over Middle Earth, Midanjard, as a sign to man over Middle Earth. And usually Earendil is interpreted as the morning star, the star that is visible before the sun goes up, and thus it is allegorically interpreted as John the Baptist before, as a kind of a precursor of Christ. Christ being the sun, John the Baptist the morning star. Now, what Tolkien was interested in is that Earendil is not a Germanic word at all. It occurs in other Germanic legends, Orendil and so on, but it is not a Germanic name. And he tried to kind of weave now tales about that figure, and he wrote in his book of Ishnes, 1914-15, a poem where he mentions Vingelot and Earendil. Vingelot becomes then the ship of Earendil. And you have that Eärendil and Vingilot in The Lord of the Rings. It's the poem that Bilbo recites in Rivendell in the Hall of Fire. Here you have a picture from 1915 depicting the shores of Faerie. I'm coming back to that in a minute, but please note, this is a drawing by Tolkien, that you have two trees, one with a fruit, the sun, and one with a fruit, the moon. And here you have a kind of a castle-like fortification. Now, in Tolkien's mythology, Eärendil becomes the messenger to the gods sent by elves and men with a Silmaril, with one of those jewels where the light of the two trees is preserved. And he asks the Valar, which are kind of the representatives of the one god on earth, for help against Melkor, which is the predecessor of Sauron. And after defeating Melkor, they put Eärendil and his ship into the sky. It's a kind of a stellification, like we know from Greek mythology. So every night, Eärendil crosses the sky in his ship Vingilot with the Silmaril, the shining Silmaril in the prow. And this is what Sam sees in Mordor. He looks up and sees this star, and he knows not all hope is lost. Even if Sauron conquers, there is still a world outside that cannot be conquered by Sauron. Another important link that Tolkien uses are genealogies. This is the genealogy of Eärendil. It is important because here you have Eärendil and his ancestry, and down here you have the two sons of Eärendil, Elros and Elrond. So you see Tolkien links his Lord of the Rings to his earlier legendarium. And down here, one of the descendants of Elros is Aragorn. So actually Aragorn is, well, related by blood to Elrond, way, way, way back. That's also how Tolkien tries to link his legendarium to the later texts. Just to sum that. I have to move a bit fast forward, but basically what Tolkien now was doing with his legendarium, he was providing a kind of a genesis. He was telling us about the creation of the world, always from an elvish point of view, as he kind of points out. So we get to know how Arda, how our world is created by the one God, how then we have something like archangels taking over the details, you could almost call it. And then we have also the fall of Melkor, which is a satanic Luciferian figure. We have a chronology, and of this it is important that we have several ages, sometimes lasting a few hundred years, sometimes lasting several thousand years. And we come to the Lord of the Rings in the Fourth Age, the end of the Third Age, beginning of Fourth Age. So the Lord of the Rings is actually something like the tip of the iceberg. And it is really the tip of the iceberg. The history of Middle-earth has been mentioned before. These 12 volumes edited by Christopher Tolkien, Tolkien's son. And there you find all these legends where he alludes to in The Lord of the Rings, or at least almost all of them. Nowadays, fantasy writers, they love to create worlds, but often they put up just a kind of a front. And if you want to look behind, there's nothing there, because they simply don't have the time. You know, Tolkien took decades to create his legendarium. You would starve as a writer of fantasy nowadays if you took decades to produce 1 or 2 books. But with Tolkien, you can be almost sure if you start digging, you will find something. Because he has been interested in the creation of his world, and if there is a question or a contradiction, he tried to solve it actually. And he tried then to invent a story that would give an explanation for that contradiction or for that question. Now we are in the 21st century, somewhere at the end of the 5th or in the 6th age. So he sees us as a continuation. Middle-earth is our world in a prehistoric time. Now, how does he link all this, these legends of the elves about the creation of the world, about the heroic tales before our time, with England? He creates in the Lost Tales a figure called Eriol or Elfwine. Elfwine is a speaking name. Elf means elf, and Wine means friend in Old English. So we have a figure that is called Elf-Friend, because he is a friend of the elves, actually. It's like Gandalf. Gandalf is me and me is Gandalf, so it's actually there. And this Elfwine or Eriol, or whatever name he is called, he's a native of Angel, which is the region on the Danish peninsula between Flensburg and the river Schlei. And this Eriol or Elfwine marries Quain, which is actually a no-name, because Quain in Old English means woman. So Elfwine marries a woman. And they have two sons, Hengest or Hengest, as Tolkien would have said, and Horsa. Now, are you familiar with Hengest and Horsa? Ever come across those? They are the semi-historical or semi-mythical leaders of the Anglo-Saxon invasion in the 5th century. So the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, when they came over, they were said to have two brothers with these rather horsey names, Hengest, meaning stallion, and Horsa, meaning horse. And so Tolkien here links his mythology via Elfwine and his sons to history or semi-history. We are already now in a time where we know the documents. Just to explain, this is Schleswig-Holstein, and Angeln would be here, this peninsula up here. And that's actually from where Elfwine and the historical Anglo-Saxons came. After the death of his wife, Cwain, Elfwine or Eriol journeys westward over the ocean to Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle, and marries an elvish woman with whom he has another son. And this other son is called Heorenda. Now, Heorenda, again, is a name that occurs in Old English poetry, in the Old English poem Deor. Deor is an Anglo-Saxon minstrel, and he complains that there has been another minstrel at the court who has ousted him, who has been in competition with him, a so-called Heorenda. And Tolkien actually believed that Heorenda is the author, the poet of Beowulf. And he links Heorenda here with Elfwine, with this figure that gets to know the legends of the elves. The tales of the elves, all these legends about the creation of the world, about the fight against Melkor, they were then written down by Eriol or Elfwine or by his son Heorenda. And when Heorenda joins his two half-brothers, Hengest and Horsa, he goes with them to Britain, which becomes England, and that's how these elvish legends end up in England. And that's why now they become the matter of England. So it's a bit complicated, but Tolkien, as a medievalist, he loved complicated kind of traditions. And so he kind of was able to link his writings, his early writings, the Legendarium, with England via the figure of Elfwine or Eriol at twice remove. However, he seemed to have then had second thoughts, and the new kind of links that we have, the links we have for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, are the Hobbits. We no longer have an Elfwine. Well, actually, we have an Elfwine. Because Frodo is once called, I call you Elf Friend. And Elf Friend is Elfwine. So we have a kind of a new mediator figure, a new link, and this time it is a hobbit. Again, you may be familiar with the inspiration through words, how the Hobbit came into existence. Tolkien was correcting examination papers, there was an empty page, and on that he scrolled, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." The Hobbit, or hobbit, was actually a word that has been around before, namely in the 1840s. We have pamphlets edited by Denham, and then re-edited by Hardy, and there, in a list of 197 words for kind of ghosts and goblins, we have number 154, it's hobbit. So we have things like portunes, grounds, hobbits, hobgoblins here. But it is not really said what hobbits are. In the index, Hardy says a class of spirits. So obviously he's also not quite sure what they are. So Tolkien has this problem. He has a word, hobbit, he doesn't really know much about. And what does Tolkien next do? He invents a story to explain what the hobbit is and what he does. There might be actually a second kind of inspiration for the Hobbit, namely a visual inspiration. This is a nursery rhyme book by Andrew Lang from 1897. So when Tolkien was 5, this was published. And there you have an old woman sitting in front of what I would call a hobbit hole. There was an old woman, lived under a hill, and if she's not gone, she lives there still. This is a British nursery rhyme. And if you just give her a pipe and dress her up a bit differently, I mean, it's Bilbo in front of his hobbit hole. Yeah, I jump that. Tolkien, as I said, didn't really make headway with what a hobbit is. There was then a second riddle which helped to create the story to explain what the hobbit is. And the second riddle comes from the Old Norse Edda. It's the so-called Dvergatal. It's a list of dwarfs, names of dwarfs, and scholars were not really sure what they mean, what the meaning is of that. And of course, you recognize we have Dvalin, Bifur, Bafur, Bombur, Nori, also Gandalfur, the Gandalf is here, Frein, Forin, Fror, and Fili, Kili, Fundinali, and Eikinshaldi. Now, Eikinshaldi, Oakenshield, is not yet it's not yet foreign, but it's a individual, another dwarf. And what Tolkien did is now he took these two kind of mysterious elements, the Hobbit and this list of dwarfish names, nobody knew what it is about, put them together and wrote The Hobbit. And so we know what Gandalfur, this staff elf, has to do in this list and what a hobbit is and what he is doing. The Hobbit originally started out actually as a children's story for Tolkien's children in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And it thus belonged to the stories and poems that Tolkien was simply inventing and telling his children. There are several other stories like Roverandom, Mr. Bliss, and so on, that have, to begin with, very little or nothing to do with the legends of the elves, to start with. The big change came then when we have elements from this side, from the legendarium, creeping into the Hobbit and taking over. And then the Hobbit actually changes sides. So from the second edition onwards, the Hobbit definitely belongs to the legendarium and no longer simply to the children's stories. So from then onwards, we can say that the Hobbits become the mediators for the legends, the matter of England, the elfish legends that become the matter of England for Tolkien. He also takes the Shire as an idealized countrified England. Tolkien once said the Shire, you have to imagine the Shire as a Warwickshire Oxfordshire area around the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, so around 1900. And it's an idealized depiction of English countryside. He also gives us the prehistory of the Shire, based a bit on the prehistory of the Anglo-Saxons. So, for example, the Hobbit migration, they were led by two brothers, Marjo and Blanco. Marjo means something like horse, and Blanco means white horse. And this, of course, reminds you a bit of some other brothers, namely Hengist and Horsa, stallion and horse. And names, Tolkien uses names to create for the English reader a feeling of Englishness, a feeling of rootedness. I come back to that in a minute. Nevertheless, the hobbits themselves, they are modern characters, so you as a reader, especially as a young reader, are able to identify with those protagonists, and they become then the gateway into this heroic, legendary world. And of course, the landscape, I think you know more about landscape than anyone else here, and it's a very important protagonist in The Lord of the Rings too. As I mentioned, Marco and Blanco, based on Hengist and Horsa, the leaders of the Anglo-Saxons. Names of the places, for example, Bag End, an English place name. Tolkien's aunt, she had a farm which was at the end of a road, and it was, I think, referred to colloquially as Bag End. Places like No Bottle, you would think at first this is a made-up place name, but actually it means New Butlan, a newly built settlement. So it's a good English place name. You find it in Oxfordshire. Gamgee, the name of Gamgee, is also a name for a family you find in Birmingham. Baggins, too, Buckland and Brandybuck. So all these names are actually good English names. And if you grew up, let's say in Oxfordshire, Warwickshire area, you would be familiar with them. So they would spell home. And as soon as you move out towards Bree, Bree is also an English name, but it has already a Celtic element. So if you're a native of Warwickshire, you feel Bree, actually this means you're moving towards the west, towards Wales. So you're getting out of the English heartland. And then, of course, comes the Wilderland. If you're interested in place names, there is a study by Rainer Nagel, Hobbit place names, so an entire book explaining to you the meanings of place names. Tolkien really spent a lot of thought on maps and place names and names in general. Modernity. Hobbits smoke pipes. They read their morning letters. And they probably have some further amenities of modern civilization. So we enter Middle-earth via the hobbits, via a kind of a, let's say, late Edwardian or late Victorian civilization. And from then onwards, we move, so to speak, backwards in time. It becomes medieval, Dark Age. Then sometimes a bit imperial, so kind of Roman antiquity. And then we go back again to this kind of Edwardian ideal that has to be restored because it is threatened by Saruman's industrialization. Landscape, I mentioned that before. And one last point, how Tolkien also links The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits to England is dialect. If you have read The Lord of the Rings in the English original, you got a kind of a little bit of dialect talk in the Ivy Bush, the pub. Gaffer Hampus Gamgee says, "A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him till he was drowned." Now, if you wrote a sentence like that, your teacher would probably correct it. What is, grammatically speaking, wrong from a standard English point of view? Drowned. Yes, for example, that. But as a dialect feature, it is perfectly acceptable. People talk like that in dialect. Or the Sackville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End, or it is to be hoped not. Won't never. Double negation. Typical dialect feature, but not accepted in standard English. Or the stranger joining in, and jewels, by what I've heard. Instead of jewels, he uses jewels, this feature. If you take these dialect features of this sample, and if you look at the Dialect Atlas of England, you can actually place the area where this dialect is spoken pretty much here. So it's the Warwickshire, Oxfordshire area where Tolkien also in his letter said that the Shire is placed. So even in the dialect talk of the Hobbits, he places great emphasis and great care on making it authentic, that you, if you read it as an Englishman, you really have the feeling these are people from there who talk to each other. If you're interested in the full story, that's the article, the bibliographical reference where Professor Johannesson made this analysis. And there are some puns you can only understand if you know that there is a dialect pronunciation of ain't. Ain't meaning is not. Ain't is sometimes pronounced ent, especially in this area. And so when Treebeard says, or when Sam says first about ent, at the Green Dragon, but this one, he's talking about a walking tree that has been seen, but this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on the North Moors. So if you pronounce this ain't like someone from Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, you should pronounce it like ant. So Sam, without knowing about ants, has already the ants in his sentence here. And Treebeard, who is a philologist anyway, he says, there are ants and ants, you know, or there are ants and things that look like ants, but ant, as you might say. So you have to be aware of these dialectal features to get the philological joke. It's typical of Tolkien. He places this, as we would call, low philological humor throughout the book. Yeah. And of course, the book. The book is the last and most important link. The Lord of the Rings that we have nowadays, and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion, they are supposedly translations out of the Elvish. Well, the Silmarillion is. The Lord of the Rings is based on the diaries of Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam. And then copied several times, supplemented, added, and so on. And it somehow has come down to Tolkien, who translated it into modern English. And so we have the last link, the Hobbit, as the historians, as the chroniclers of these events, as translators of the Elvish legend, Bilbo translating what nowadays is the Silmarillion out of Elvish into Hobbitish, the common speech, passing it down, and Tolkien is the last link who then translates it into English and thus gives us the matter of England that has been long lost. So it takes a kind of a communal effort with a few turns, but in the end, Tolkien, you could say, managed to recreate or to rediscover the lost matter of England. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Thomas, for this also illuminating speech. I think there are several things here that I was not aware of at all. Actually, the puns, for example, the dialectal puns regarding ents and so on and so forth. So we're all learning here today, I think, all of us. I mean, and this is important at these events. I think that we are supposedly out of time here, and it's supposedly time for the coffee break, but. And we will get back to Nick, to Thomas, and to Eduardo at 12 o'clock when we begin the roundtable discussion. And you will be able to make questions to the three of them for quite a long time then. So we will have quite a long time for questions and for debates afterwards. But if there is anything that you would like to ask, just that has occurred to you during this first interventions, feel free to ask some brief question, and then we can enlarge on the debate later on. Is there anyone around today here who would like to say something or ask something? Spontaneous reaction to these conferences? Well, if not, then we'll go on the coffee break, and we'll be back here again at 12 o'clock for the roundtable discussion. And make sure to bring your notes and to bring some questions.
It's second breakfast time.
Yeah.
Es el momento del segundo desayuno.